We are in the book of Deuteronomy. We're almost halfway through it. And at this point, Moses shifts gears. And something that's been enlightening to me about the book of Deuteronomy, if you get nothing else out of it through our short study of it, here's what I hope you get. That warnings, even though are hard to hear at times, are extremely loving. Moses spends a month warning a group of people he's been serving and loving faithfully for decades. And when they are on the banks of the Jordan River about to have all of their dreams come true, instead of just going around patting everyone on the back, telling them, you did it, we did it, we're here, he does something different. The longest message, the longest sermon recorded in the Bible is the book of Deuteronomy. And its entire content is spent giving loving warnings to a group of people. Now, I don't know if you consider warning people a loving thing to do. But according to God, and certainly according to the example Moses gives us, it's extremely loving. So before we start, is there anybody you have avoided warning because you're afraid it will be offensive, or it'll sound awful, or they're going to take it the wrong way? If so, I want you to be encouraged by the book of Deuteronomy of doing the very, very hard and loving thing of warning people who are headed towards a road maybe you've seen before, maybe you've been down that road before, and you want to scream to them in a loving and kind way, don't do it, because you know where that road goes. And you may not say anything because you think, well, they're going to respond the same way I would respond if someone warned me. Okay, that was you, but I'm the exception to the rule. Thank you for that wisdom, but I would just soon. Don't do that. It is very difficult in this day and age to offer people a warning that you are well aware of. But it is very unloving not to. If you get nothing else out of the book of Deuteronomy, I hope you'll gather the strength and the bravery it takes to sometimes offering a loving warning. And that's what Moses is doing. Now, as we shift into this part of his sermon, Deuteronomy is 3 sermons packed into one. And now he's going to shift from offering general warnings to people to very specific instructions. And as people living thousands of years later, it is so easy to disregard the specific instruction Moses gives as to, well, that was for them at that time. How on earth could we apply anything like that at this time? We can't. In fact, there's laws set up so we don't do it like that anymore. And I get that. What I want to challenge you to do is something that I've been challenging myself as I'm reading through the middle section of Deuteronomy. Let's look at not the specific instructions you're about to see, but what are the principles that are underneath those, that are fueling those instructions. Take a look with me at those as we examine Deuteronomy and see if God is putting something in us in terms of principles to apply. Maybe not a specific instruction like a prescription in the book of Deuteronomy, but maybe a description of a principle that is timeless, no matter what culture you're in or what part of the planet you're from. So let's look here. Moses has been uncovering different hazards that blessings can and will provide. And that's a loving thing to say. It's not an easy thing to say, but it's a loving thing to say. And we've looked at a number already, and we'll continue today. And the next one he's going to show us is there is a hazard of being tired that is specifically linked to when you get your way. When the struggle ends and all your dreams come true, there's a unique hazard of being tired. And I'll show you where that's coming from in chapter 12, verse 10. And before I read it, there's really just 2 things I want to say about this specific hazard. As I look at what Moses tells us or teaches us, I believe he's teaching us a couple things. One, it takes energy to trust God. Nobody does that easily. It takes a lot of energy to trust God. And some of us are spending our energy on all kinds of things that we don't need to be, and then we're giving God the leftover energy we have to trust Him. And what Moses is making clear is that it's not easy to trust God in the wilderness it's extremely more difficult to trust him when you're in the castle. So look with me in chapter 12, verse 10. Moses tells these people who've only known poverty their whole life, you will cross the Jordan and settle in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. And he will give you rest from all your enemies around you so that you will live in safety. Doesn't that sound good? The promise of rest from all your enemies. You will get to be in a place where you can finally exhale and don't have to have watchman upon watchman every night ready for the next group of people, the next nation who wants to take you out while you're living in tents in the wilderness. You're coming to a place where there'll be walls, and you'll actually have a home. And you'll get rest. And I want you to hear that that is a very, very good thing. But what comes with it is a sense of difficulty. While these people have been in the wilderness, the hard work of trusting God has been the decision to actually go where the cloud goes and actually go where the fire goes, because the presence of God has been showing up in the form of a cloud during the day and a fire at night, this miraculous fire and cloud that they could physically see, and all they had to do was believe that that miraculous cloud and fire was taking them somewhere good, and then make the hard decision of actually following it. But now that they're going to be in the promised land, there will be no cloud. There will be no fire. God is going to have to be trusted without being physically seen. And that will be hard, because the thing that everybody does, we all do when we're finally safe, is what? We exhale and we let our guard down. I saw a movie recently that really made this come to light. I don't know how you feel about movies, and I get nervous about talking about any from up here, thinking that I'm endorsing every bit of the content that's in here. They're just very moving to me. Some people are like that, some people are not, but it's just how I'm wired. I don't show the clip, I just kind of tell the story. But there's a movie called Hacksaw Ridge. And it's a movie about World War II, and it's about a young soldier named Desmond who unbelievably saves life after life, stays up all night saving 70-some lives. But the most powerful scene in that movie to me is after he comes off of this ridge, after having survived the unthinkable, and he comes down and he's finally not having to worry every second of his life, like he has been saving lives up on this ridge. And when he comes down and the people put their hands around him and they touch him, and first he's just very nervous, because that's what he's been like for the last 12 hours. But when he comes down and finally realizes, I can breathe, I'm okay, I'm around people who aren't trying to kill me. As soon as that happens, you watch him physically collapse. His face changes, his body changes. They have to carry him, not because he's injured, but because he's safe. And he's tired. And the struggle's over. And that's so moving to me, because when it comes to our faith, when we feel like we don't have to push to survive anymore, when we're not counting on God every second just to get us through, when we're not experiencing grief and we're not experiencing trial, it's very easy just to go, And what happens in those moments, spiritually speaking, is faith becomes lukewarm. It's very dangerous and very real. And I don't know if you've read what the Bible says about lukewarm faith, but it's pretty bad. Prosperity brings lukewarm faith. Poverty doesn't. Because in poverty, you're just trying to survive. It's a real hazard. According to God, hard is good. How many of you feel that way? Do you believe things that are hard are good? I did it until I learned how to ride a bike. My youngest son, Dax, learned how to ride a bike when he was 3 years old. Amazing coordination. Must have got that from his mom. It wasn't me. I was almost 9 when I learned how to ride a bike. And my parents, to their credit, with all their patience, they pushed me and ran with me and everything you can think of. I don't know how many miles my folks logged in just trying to get me to balance this thing. I just couldn't do it. So finally my dad had an idea. He tied my bicycle to his motorcycle. And he got on the motorcycle on our gravel road and took off. And amazingly, I'm on the bicycle, and it is balancing because we're going, I don't know how fast. It felt like Mach 3, but it was probably only 10 miles an hour. But to an 8-year-old who can't balance on a bike, it was going fast. And so once we got going, and my eyes are wide open, and I'm holding on for dear life, he unhitched the rope to the motorcycle, and it's me on my own. And you know what was amazing? I didn't crash. I don't know how I didn't crash, but I didn't. But I was dialed in just to survive. During those motorcycle training days, I never once crashed my bike. Not once. I've had several bike accidents since then. And every time I crashed my bike, it was because things were fine. I knew how to ride a bike. I know what I'm doing. Not really paying attention to my surroundings. Kind of let my guard down a little bit, which is what you do when you feel safe and confident. And then, boom, crash. When things are hard, when I'm scared to death, no crash. But when I got confident, when I got a little arrogant, when I got safe, that's when I started to crash. Faith isn't a whole lot different than bicycles in that regard. I want to read you another verse in verse 26 of the same chapter. He says, "Take your consecrated things and whatever you have vowed to give and go to the place the Lord will choose." This is a worship system that God is saying, you can't just do whatever you want wherever you want to do it. Because the place they're taking over, who didn't worship God at all, had a very different system. Their belief was, you can just do whatever you want, wherever you want. And in chapter 12 at the beginning, it talks about these high places. And the land that they're capturing had these little churches, I guess you could call them, all over the hillside. And God says, when you get into this land, first of all, take out all of those, and you will build the church, not where you want, not where it's convenient for you, where I choose. It'll be one place, and that is where you are to come, bring your consecrated offerings. That's where you're to come to worship. And God's system that He's setting up is hard intentionally. Instead of just going where you want, however you want, this consumer mentality, you will come to one place at one time. He's making it hard on purpose. Because hard is good. Some people have asked me not that long ago, do you have to go to church if you're a Christian? Didn't Jesus say there is coming a time where you'll not worship on this mountain or in this place, where the Spirit of God will be released and you'll have access to the very presence of God? Why do you even need to go to church? Can't you just get God on a YouTube video at home? We may need to go into that at length. But what I would say is everything I read and everything I study from Scripture, maybe you're right from a philosophical standpoint, because the reality is the presence of God is not locked into one place and one location. Did you hear that? The presence of God is not limited to anyone at any time. You and I, whether we're in our car or sitting in here, have access to the actual presence of God Almighty who created the universe. Do you know that? And it's not confined to this church or any other church. That's unbelievable. But the Bible is also very consistent about something happens when folks come together that cannot happen when you're sitting in your car, listening to the podcast, or sitting at home watching the YouTube video. There's something different that happens. But in Deuteronomy, God set up a worship system that makes people get out of their houses and come to one place. Not the place that's closest to their house, one place. Because the temptation, when things get easy, is just to relax. So it takes energy to trust God. You know what else takes a lot of energy? To hate idolatry. Here's a good question for your notes to ask yourself, not anybody else, just you. Do you hate idolatry? Do you hate it? Do you know what it is? We're going to talk about it in a minute because Moses spends a good amount of time talking about it. Now again, he's going to mention some specific guidelines that I don't believe we're to practice today, So let's look at the principle underneath them in chapter 13. Verse 6. If your very own brother or your son or daughter or the wife you love or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, gods of the peoples around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other. Verse 8, do not yield to them or listen to them. Show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your own brother, your own son, your daughter, your wife, your closest friend. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all the people. Stone them. So let's talk about the principle underneath that. Stoning is an execution form where everybody pitches in. Everybody casts a vote against the idolatry. Everyone picks up a stone. This is completely severe. Now, I didn't read verse 14, but if you look down, if you have a Bible, Moses says, investigate thoroughly. Don't just come to conclusions real quick. Ask some hard questions. If this is actually what's going on. If idolatry is what's happening. But if it is, there are severe consequences for this. And apparently, idolatry is very natural to happen, not when things are bad, but when things are great. When bank accounts are safe and bodies are safe, that's when we let our guard down and begin to worship idols. Even God's people dangerously worship idols. And he says, your loved ones have the strongest influence over you. Therefore, the penalty for that has to be the most severe. Do you think idolatry is that big a deal? Would you have that severe consequence for idolatry? So here's a working definition of idolatry. It won't be on the screen. I'll just share it with you. Idolatry is loving the wrong thing too much or loving the right thing too much. That's a dumb way. Let's rephrase that. Idolatry is loving the wrong thing at all and loving the right thing too much. That's a pretty good definition of sin. I believe all sin comes back to idolatry. Is there anything that you love in place of God? We're in the Bible Belt in Texas. No one's going to say yes, especially those sitting in a church. Of course not. Is there anything that you love alongside of God? Is there anything that drives your identity, that gives you meaning, that makes you feel like a good person, that makes you feel secure and strong alongside of the gospel? Is there anything like that? Because if there is, that is called idolatry. Idolatry is anything that takes the apple of the eye, the place of your being, of your heart, that God doesn't hold alone. Do Christians worship anything other than Christ? Anything alongside Him? Because what Moses is talking about, when you look at what happened with them, that's what happened. The whole golden calf thing, they weren't worshiping a calf, they were worshiping God with a calf. That was the problem. That was idolatry. When I got here to Hereford 7 months ago, I started then and I have been ever since then. And I don't think I'll ever stop because I'm new. I'm new to the community. I've asked God to show me a couple things about Hereford, Texas. One, what are the great things about the culture here that need to be affirmed? That need to say, well, this is who we are and this is fantastic. God has allowed this to blossom. This is fantastic. What are those incredible things about the culture of Hereford, Texas that need to be affirmed? And what are the things about the culture of Hereford, Texas that lead to idolatry that have to be confronted? Both have to occur. As one of the spiritual leaders of this community, I feel like I am not doing my job if I miss the boat on both of those. It's not enough to just do one or the other. There's fantastic things about Hereford, Texas that we need to affirm and celebrate. And there are awful things about Hereford, Texas culture that lead to idolatry that we have to confront. Confronting idolatry is not an Old Testament system. Do you know what those things are? Wouldn't that be a great use of a spiritual conversation you have with your spouse or your family? What are the God-given blessings of this culture? And what are the God-dishonoring idols in this culture? And don't just think of bad things that people worship instead of God. Think of the good things people worship too much alongside Him. Verse 16 of chapter 13. Talking about towns now. You are to gather all the plunder of the town into the middle of the public square and completely burn the town and all of its plunder as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. That town is to remain a ruin forever and never, ever be rebuilt. Which just says, to do all of that, to take plunder and collect it and then burn it, takes an entire community to do that. It cannot be one or two people's job. It cannot be the spiritual leaders of your community who are the only ones concerned about confronting idols. It takes an entire community to do a couple things. One, to outline to people, to specifically look at them and congratulate them and pat them on the back and say, it's obvious from this that you love God more than you love His blessings. And I'm proud of you. Now, you're not going to be able to say that unless you watch people suffer, because that's the only time that becomes real. You don't know if people love God instead of His blessings until the blessings stop. Then you know. So when you see someone like that who's going through something hard, are you watching to see how they respond? And does their faith stay strong? Do they still love God and talk about how good He is despite how awful their circumstances are? When they do, they need and deserve to be patted on the back by a community of faithful people. That's one way as a community we confront idols. We praise it when it's not happening. But the second way is to challenge it and confront it when it is. Who it looks to me like you're valuing something as much as you do the God you claim to worship. I don't know which one is more true or not. It seems dangerous to me. Have you thought about this? That is a very risky conversation to have. But based on what's at stake, I think it's a necessary one. Again, not one or the other, not only confronting or challenging and not only encouraging, both. That's what a community is for. So, let's go to the next hazard. That's enough of that one. Interestingly enough, according to Moses, one of the hazards that accompany blessing is being greedy. And I didn't see that one coming. I would have thought greed was isolated to people who don't have anything, and they just want more, so that they'll have enough. But apparently, according to Moses, greed is specifically and especially attached to those who have a lot and want more. So, here we go. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. Be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Now listen to what you're supposed to do with the tenth in verse 23. Eat the tithe of your grain, so you're not eating like gold, that's gross. Eat the tithe of your grain, your new wine and olive oil, the firstborn of your herds and flocks, in the presence of the Lord your God at the place He will choose as a dwelling for His name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. I don't know if you guys know this, but potlucks go all the way back to Deuteronomy. Isn't that a model of potlucks? Now, some of you, when you come to potlucks, are not bringing a tenth or certainly your best. Some of you just stop and get a bag of Oreos and show up with the potluck. And I would say, in the spirit of Deuteronomy, don't do that anymore. The tithes, according to Moses, are not put in an envelope and mailed. They're consumed together. Not just one family, but collectively. The whole purpose of this system is to share God's goodness together. And I wanted you to see something that I don't think I noticed until I started studying Deuteronomy. It says, so that, and never miss that, so that the reason to do this is to not just bring tithes, but consume them together, is so that you will learn to revere. Have you ever attached reverence with celebration before? That revering God and keeping Him at the place He rightfully deserves is directly connected to celebrating Him. Apparently it is. Apparently you can't revere what isn't a blast to you. And later on in chapter 14, says it kind of in a similar way. He says, you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. Now let me ask you a trivia question. You may not know it. Don't answer it out loud. There's no need to impress anybody. When Paul talked to the Corinthians about giving, he said, God loves a what kind of giver? Okay, you impressed everyone. That was good. A cheerful giver. Not a big giver. Not a consistent giver, but a cheerful one. Grateful joy will kill greed. Calculating, striving for a percent minimum. And for some of you, to be very honest, 2% would be a large improvement from what you have been used to giving God in the past forever of your life. But don't strive for 2%. Don't strive for 3%. Don't strive for 50%. I knew an owner of a company who tithed 90% of his income and lived off the 10%. That sounds impressive, doesn't it? Don't strive for that. It mentions about a tithe, set apart a tithe, but consume it in the presence as a dwelling so you may learn to revere. Eat and enjoy. Rejoice. Whether it's 1%, or 90%. God does not love a big giver. And He doesn't love a consistent giver. He loves a cheerful giver because, at least partly, that cheerfulness will outlast greed. That will battle greed. The last verse I'm going to read to you is verses 4 and 11 in chapter 15, and then we'll close. Moses says, there need be no poor people among you. For in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, He will richly bless you. There'll be everything you need so no one has to go wanting. And then shortly later, he says in verse 11, there will always be poor people in the land. Is that a contradiction? He says there shouldn't be any poor people, and then a few verses later he says there's always going to be poor people. So what happened between verse 4 and verse 11? The hazard of greed. Folks don't become generous when they're richly blessed. Folks get greedy and stingy. And they count on organizations to do it. And what I wanted you to see is the whole system for providing for the poor is not for an entity like a church to make sure everyone has need. It's for individuals to have their radars on and looking for need and to personally give. Oh, well, who wants to do that? There's no tax break if you do that. You're right, there's not. Is it the church's responsibility to take care of the poor in Hereford, Texas? No. We'll do it because we love to. But it is not our responsibility. It's the responsibility of every person who's been transformed by the grace of God to have their eyes out for those who have need and to meet that need when and where they can. When individuals do it because they love Christ, He gets glory from it. When churches do it, from my experience of being employed by one for 15 plus years, it's their job. They're supposed to. God doesn't get any glory from that. They get criticism when they don't do it, but they get no glory for doing it, no matter how abundantly well they do it. But when individuals do it, knowing they don't get a tax break for inviting someone to stay in their house, taking someone to lunch, when that happens, it completely changes.